Now, it's 2:04. Sathnam Sanghera has written another book. It's brilliant. It's called Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. But it isn't one of those books that shouts at you and tells you how bad everything is and how bad you are. It is an incredibly well-researched, cogent, brimming with his personality and well worth getting hold of. And that's why we've got him on the show, quite frankly, because if it was rubbish, it would be a waste of time and this would be an awkward 45 minutes of my time and his time. Sathnam, hello, sir.
Hello, Nihal.
Lovely to see you.
Thank you for the kind words.
Well, I mean, it's not just me. I mean, there's loads of quotes from all kinds of people about how brilliant this book is and how well it's been reviewed by so many people. In writing this book, Sathnam, were any of your absolutes confounded?
Well, I came from the point of view of not knowing much about empire, and I think I'm not untypical. I mean, I was taught almost nothing about empire. Even in the 40 or 50 Remembrance Day services I've sat through in my life, at no point has anyone said, by the way, millions of imperial troops, people, your ancestors were also fighting alongside us. We were taught about, the potato famine in Ireland at school, but no one said, actually, there's a good comparison to be made to India, because that was happening roughly the same time. And I think we have a strange view of empire in this country. It's a combination of kind of amnesia and nostalgia. The amnesia comes to the fact that we don't really see ourselves as the country that had the greatest empire in history. We see ourselves as the country that won World War II and beat the evil racist Germans. And what that does, it papers over the fact that in 19th century, the British Empire was a willfully racist, genocidal enterprise. And the nostalgia comes in that there's a popular view that you can somehow weigh the positives against the negatives, the massacres against the railways, and come to a conclusion about whether empire was good or bad. And it's just an absurd way of looking at 500 years of history because, history is not a laptop you bought from Argos. You can't give it a 5-star rating. I think it makes much more sense, as I argue in my book, to look at the legacies of empire because those are things we live with on a daily basis.
Interesting, when you talk about it being a willfully genocidal enterprise, why is it that we find it so difficult to accept that? It's not an opinion, it's fact.
Well, I argue in my book, it's quite painful, isn't it? I mean, I see myself as British and Asian. I found it very difficult to sit there night after night reading about how Sikhs were murdered during, various wars, how 400 Jamaicans were killed during the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865, how the Tasmanian Aborigines were more or less wiped out in a genocide by the British. Because I am British, so I want to believe the best things about my nation. But I also think in order to work out who you are, you need to work out who you were. And in the same way you might undergo therapy as an individual, I think we need to undergo therapy as a nation about our history.
But it is utterly naive to think about your history as just being this linear, chronological, date-by-date record of brilliance and positivity. I mean, it's naive. I'm of Sri Lankan heritage. I know exactly how badly Sri Lankans have treated each other and our history towards each other and our violence towards each other. And it's helped, I think, the country of Sri Lanka, where my parents are from, to understand itself better. And it's not in a good place by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly to move forward in understanding where it's been.
But we've got this absurd idea now in Britain that somehow you need to be proud of British imperial history in order to be patriotic. I don't think this really occurs elsewhere. I mean, in Germany, you can talk about the Holocaust and still be proudly German. In Japan, you can talk about kamikaze pilots and still be proudly Japanese. But in the UK, you've got this idea where if you're ashamed about anything that Britain did over the last 500 years, you're not patriotic. You should get back to where you came from.
Yes, that is often cited. But is that a problem that states that if you are not white, you have no right to criticise the past?
Yes, this is the hardest thing about writing a book about British Empire if you're like us, in that the most common accusation is that you should be more grateful. And at the heart of that is a racist idea because you and I were born here, the idea we're second-generation immigrants.
Go back to where you come from. You go, well, I will go back to Wolverhampton when I can move finally on the trains, or I'll go back to Essex.
And it's a very common response. Get back to be more grateful. And it's like, I have the right to observe positive and negative things about the nation I love as much as my white colleagues. Why don't they get told to be more grateful?
How, in researching this book, did it make you feel about being British and being proud to be British?
It made me feel very confused about why we struggle so much with facing up to the basic fact of our history. I mean, multiculturalism is probably the most obvious legacy of empire. The reason you, a British Asian, are sitting there talking to me, a British Asian, is that a bunch of Britons invaded the subcontinent in the 18th and 19th century. Yet the most dominant narrative of my life has been the idea that brown people came here uninvited and took advantage of the hospitality. It's kind of been forgotten that the reason we have a multicultural society is that we had a multicultural empire. The people who went on the Windrush, they weren't even coming here for jobs. They were coming here as citizens because the 1948 Nationality Act made them citizens of Britain. And we've completely forgotten about that.
How does it change the narrative if, as you write in the book, and you're quoting someone else, that we think about it as colonizing in reverse?
Yeah, I mean, that makes the whole debate about not only multiculturalism, but racism much more honest. I mean, there's so much of the pressure is put on immigrant communities to integrate, to learn English, and I believe that we have to do that. But I think there should also be pressure put on the host community to acknowledge that we're here for a reason, not only to rebuild the country after World War II, but because we were colonized for centuries, sometimes fought in our millions in both world wars, and it's rarely acknowledged.
You do mention the myopia from within ethnic minority communities as well in the book, don't you?
Absolutely, but I don't think it's like a battle between who's worst.
No.
It's that idea of everything needs to be black and white, there needs to be one person.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes. Well, you do talk about that as well, the kind of puerile nature of looking at imperialism as being good and bad. And that's what you need to move away from, the binary nature of this conversation, that somehow if you challenge it, you're bad or you're unpatriotic.
Yeah, and I think it's happened over the last 15 years with historians like Niall Ferguson and Jeremy Black who've put forward the positive view of empire. But that has been parodied into this common view that empire was always good. I don't think Niall Ferguson doesn't say that in his book. He acknowledges the massacres, the white supremacy, the genocide, but he says overall, British Empire wasn't as bad as other empires. But it's become this puerile public debate that we have. And unfortunately, a certain sect of the Conservative Party has hijacked the argument and now is regularly sowing division around the subject of empire because it realizes it's an easy way to win votes. So last week, when we discovered that we had one of the highest death rates in the world from COVID, Robert Jenrick, a minister, was writing a column in one of our papers saying, we need to introduce laws to protect statues. And it's like, what is that about? That's because he recognizes that defending British Empire is deemed patriotic and it plays well, with focus groups, but it's no reflection of the actual complexity of the history.
Well, this is not dissimilar to President Trump, former President Trump, of course, calling for quote unquote patriotic education to defend American history. I mean, it's not a million miles away.
The same thing, it's culture wars. And you can divide these wars along in clear boundaries. I mean, you've got black versus white, you've got the race culture war, you've got the empire culture war. In America, you've got the playing out of the Civil War repeatedly. And these are the new divisions now.
But how important is it of those who want to move this conversation forward to use language that is not in itself divisive?
Yeah, I mean, I think language is important. And I say in the acknowledgements of the book that one of the problems of talking about empire is that, for example, we talk about the Indian Mutiny in such different ways. The British call it the Indian Mutiny, and other people call it the Sepoy War. In India, they call it the First War of Independence. And language matters because you view those incidences in a very different way, depending on the words that you use.
tell us why Manhattan is important in the story of the British Empire.
Oh, so this very quite surprising deal that was done, whereby it is argued that empire began when the British and the Dutch and loads of countries joined a competition to find spices in the Far East. And the British ended up fighting over this tiny island called Run.
Nutmeg and mace, yes, was important.
Yeah, basically in Indonesia. And this war went on for ages. And in the end, the British swapped this tiny island of Run for New Amsterdam. So that's how we inherited New York City. So the imperial stories behind these kind of the modern geography are fascinating.
And Deen Mohammed.
Okay, I'll use Deen Mohammed in the book as an example of how actually people of colour have been here for centuries. Queen Elizabeth I was complaining about there being too many black people in London
Moors,
in the 1600s.
She was complaining about the Moors, wasn't she?
Absolutely. And Deen Mohammed was one of the, was a man from India who came to Ireland and then came to London. He opened the first ever curry house in central London. He then became a shampoo surgeon, which is a kind of massage guy.
Yes,
and
in Brighton,
opening a bathhouse in Brighton. Yeah. And the king came. So he got a royal warrant. He helped popularize the word shampoo. He had an interracial marriage, like centuries before that was deemed controversial. And I was never taught about Deen Mohammed. And yet he changed Britain. And I think we need to diversify our school curriculum so people like that are taught.
Let's listen to this.
This is a life, hey, Dad. You and me sitting on the veranda, enjoying a perfect English summer's evening.
There's nothing English about the word veranda. It's an Indian word.
Is it?
Of course. They go on about this beautiful language, the Queen's English. Rubbish! Where did the Queen get a word like veranda? She stole it from India.
I didn't know that.
And shampoo? It's an Indian word. And bungalow, jungle.
Right. Okay.
You see, you have these English people sitting on the verandas of their bungalows, looking at the jungle, using their shampoo. They talk about Western civilization? Rubbish!
Well, I don't think you can discount the whole of Western civilization just because they borrowed the word shampoo.
Yeah, not just shampoo. Also conditioner. Brill cream, gel, mousse, wash and go. They stole them from India.
That's brilliant, Sanjeev Bhaskar, of course. Goodness gracious me, with that character that thought everything was from India. But in all of the examples you gave there, of course, very true indeed. Apart from the conditioner, definitely wasn't an Indian word. So let's talk more about Deen Mohammed there and yes, being here hundreds of years ago and being part of the establishment here. Absolutely.
But also, I mean, our multiculturalism is a legacy of empire, but our racism, our particular brand of racism in Britain, comes from empire. I mean, one of the things we always say about the Sikhs, I'm Sikh, is that we're a martial race, right? Yes. That was an idea created by the British, mainly after the mutiny, because we took the side of the British at the 1857 mutiny, and they decided that we were therefore good fighters and the martial race. And they actually published handbooks describing why we had the perfect physical attributes to be fighters. Not that you could tell that from my physique.
Yes.
But so the British created
pretty big Sikh lads out there, though, to be fair. Yeah.
The British created all sorts of racial generalizations, which persist now. I mean, there was a survey done recently saying that 44% of Britons believe that some races are born to be harder working than others. And I would argue, I do argue in Empireland, that those generalizations go back to empire.
Yes. Well, you make the point, don't you, that when people had to give up their slaves, indentured Indians were sent to various parts of the world to do those jobs because they were regarded to be harder workers. But that didn't stay, did it? That impression that...
No, they completely changed their mind. And by the time loads of Indians were coming to the UK in the 60s, they were deemed by the Colonial Office to be lazy, which is quite a surprising thing to hear about British Asians, because one thing you can say about us, or at least our parents, is they were never lazy. No. But, I mean, the black community were massively demonized. Initially, they were regarded as very good workers compared to Indians in the 60s. But then they were deemed lazy. And all of those generalizations go straight back to slavery.
So, on the odd occasion where I am forced to justify my existence here in the UK, I do have to point out to the individual concerned, and thankfully it's a very small amount of people, that we were invited over here, that my parents were invited over here, my mother into the NHS and my dad to work in engineering. But you make a really good point in the book, because often we do talk about our parents and our grandparents in that context, but actually it's wider than that, isn't it? Take the Windrush, for example.
Yes, I mean, the Windrush, it's incredible. I mean, you just need to look at the narrative. They came here as citizens, and then they helped to rebuild Britain, joined the NHS, helped build the NHS and so on. But now we're in a situation where actual citizens are being deported. I mean, nothing summarizes our screwed up attitudes about empire more than that. That a citizen can come from empire and end up being deported. It's an incredible thing. I mean, I similarly struggle with the phrase second generation immigrant. In what way are you and I immigrants, man? It's like, I'm less of an immigrant than many white people.
Well, you go to the Punjab or I go to a part of Sri Lanka, and there's no question, a mile off, they know that we're not born and bred in that part.
It's your haircut, Nihal.
It's your baseball cap, Sathnam. It's so many texts coming in for you. We started a very interesting conversation here on 5 Live. Steve in Manchester says, Sathnam is bang on. White British, by and large, either celebrate the empire or simply turn off to it, though even those people, by and large, celebrate the Union Jack, monarchy, rule Britannia, etc. We need a decent national museum acknowledging the horrors of our imperialist past. Only then can we start to understand and move on. Contemporary white people don't need to grovel and apologise, but we do need to understand. And that's a very good point, Steve, is a very good point. David in Carlisle said, I'm sorry, but you've got it wrong. Most British people know the empire was built on terrible wrongdoings, but we're still proud of that empire and the good things it brought. Also, we are very aware of the sacrifices made by empire troops during both world wars. You're talking to us like we haven't a clue about our history. You are wrong. Well, I mean, look, that's your lived experience, David in Carlisle. My lived experience as a little brown boy growing up in Essex was that nobody in any history lesson ever told us that there were non-white soldiers involved in the First World War. Not a single peep of it.
And just look at what happened to Lawrence Fox. I mean, he became nationally famous for objecting to the inclusion of a Sikh in 1917.
Yes, and then he had to apologise because he knew that it was pointed out to him robustly that he hadn't a clue what he was talking about.
And when you look at what happened after World War I, the imperial contribution was deliberately deleted. The imperial troops weren't included in the celebrations that happened in London.
Tell me a Second World War film that you watched growing up, Sathnam, that had a single main character of colour as a soldier in it.
None. The first one was The English Patient, which had a Sikh. And actually, I then read the book, and the Sikh is a much bigger character. So it then annoyed me that the character was so minor in the film.
So, David in Carlisle, your lived experience is one thing, our lived experience is an entirely different one. Paul has said, excellent feature discussing empire, thank you. I'm sure the author Sathnam appreciates this, but bear in mind that colour is not the sole factor for consideration. Given the colonisation of Ireland and the experience of the Irish in Britain after the mass migration post-famine, and also in the 1970s, 80s, of course one can't draw direct comparisons between different communities' experiences, but the vast majority of second, third generation Irish would echo the sentiments of your contributor. Well, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs.
Absolutely.
We're all completely aware of that.
Actually, I've got a long passage in the book comparing how the Irish were treated in Wolverhampton a century before my parents arrived. Exactly the same things happened. The Irish were said to not speak the language. They were given the worst jobs. They were victimized by the police. They weren't allowed to buy housing, or they lived in ghettos, in terrible slum housing. And the same thing keeps happening again and again in our history. Partly, I think, because we understand our history so badly.
Stuart in London texted in, and feel free, we want texts, support, criticising, questioning. That's exactly why we're having this conversation, a civilised, calm conversation, as opposed to sometimes the conversations which other perhaps broadcasters or whatever set up where they'll get one person on one side, another person on the other side, and then they'll just shout at each other for half an hour. We don't do that here. We think that's ridiculous. Stuart in London says, your guest, Sathnam, My problem with the interviewee is that he's making very sweeping generalizations about what this country thinks about history and empire. It's a class thing. I'm educated, middle class, working in state education. I don't know anyone in family or friends who has this myopic view, or my social set have no trouble balancing their Britishness against the acknowledged unforgivable sins of the past. We know what we did. We're not apologetic about it because we personally didn't do these things, but we totally understand it and assimilate that knowledge into our decisions and viewpoints, as Germans and Japanese do. Listen to your interviewee, you'd think this understanding wasn't already out there. I'm more optimistic than that, says Stuart. Sathnam.
Thing is, I think my experience is that people really don't know anything about the empire. There's loads of examples. One of my favorite examples is when Tony Blair handed back Hong Kong to the Chinese. He writes in his biography that he had very little understanding of the history, which is incredible. He didn't know about the Opium Wars. And I've met commentators for newspapers who've done history at Oxford who didn't study any colonialism throughout their education, had to teach themselves in their 30s and their 40s. And I think that's routine.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But also as well, very recent history tells us that this current government are not willing to expand the curriculum.
No, it's become one of the culture wars that they fight. I mean, they've basically realised there's votes in being proud of British Empire and they're going for it. But at the same time, Boris Johnson will make a video for Black History Week saying Black history is British history. But then at another time, he'll say something incredibly nostalgic about empire. I don't think they've really thought it out themselves.
What are your thoughts on an Empire Day?
Well, Empire Day was a thing that actually existed.
It did,
that once a year, school kids would have lessons in how empire was enriching to our national culture and our economy. And I think we should bring it back in a way. It still exists in the form of Commonwealth Day, but I think we should bring it back and we should teach people all the ways in which empire, defines us, good and bad. I mean, one of the positive things is that we are an incredibly internationalist country in that we travel and relocate almost like no other nation on earth. And that goes back to empire in that we have a history of traveling. But like the things that you said in that comedy clip, there's so many things that go back to empire. So many businesses like Shell, Liberties. Wembley Stadium was initially called the Empire Stadium. The Scouts were called the Imperial Scouts. Our police system was initially tested out in Ireland. Fingerprinting was initially tested out in Calcutta. And so many daily things go back to empire. And that was almost the point of Empire Day, to teach kids of the daily value of empire.
This text has come in saying, just ordered the book. Everything you and the author have discussed is spot on. I'm proud to be British, proud of all my compatriots, but deeply ashamed of Britain's imperial legacy. To my mind, the only good that has come from empire is our country's multiculturalism. Hi Nihal and guest, you're right. We only won World War I and World War II with the help of the citizens of the empire. Look at the 4th Indian Division's actions in Tunisia. Good historians like James Holland and Yasmin Khan always point this out. We all need to address our lack of historical knowledge before talking about others. We owe a huge amount to the people we screwed over. Finally, someone of minority finally telling it how it is rather than following the typical mindset that we should be grateful and have been given something to be here and owe something to the UK for being here. Their forefathers raped, stole and pillaged the lands of our forefathers. Britain could not make amends to those countries enough reparations for what damage they've done, African and Asian countries. This text come in saying, why do we have to be ashamed of this country's history? It's lazy and easy to judge the past by the values of today. We must and can only be judged by the values of the times, and the British Empire was not the demonic enterprise that your author seeks to exploit for gain. Okay, I mean, using words like demonic enterprise. Give some examples of where the British Empire was a white supremacist enterprise and willfully genocidal. Sathnam, in order for the text.
Well, actually, I write about what happened with the Aborigines in Tasmania. There were about 4,000 to 8,000 of them. And they were basically wiped out to such a degree that what happened there is used in the international legal definition of genocide. It was one of the first ever examples used. It was a straightforward wiping out of an entire group of people, although there's an argument now they've returned in some form. But what happened in the mutiny of 1857, became a race war in that you had Brits taking racial revenge on Indians for what happened. I mean, people were blown to bits at the end of cannons. They were buried alive. Entire villages were razed to the ground purely because they were Indian. And that psyche, what happened in 1857, had such a legacy. That's largely why Jallianwala Bagh happened, why 700 people were murdered in Amritsar 100 years ago. And there's so many examples like that. It was actually quite depressing to sift through all those examples.
85058 is the text number. Sathnam Sanghera is here talking about his book, Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. And I would like to know your thoughts about it. So many texts coming in, Sathnam. I'm a British Asian school teacher. The British Empire was recognisable for many great things, including bringing democracy and the English language to India. The British also banned the vile Hindu practice of sati. My parents left Pakistan because as Christians they were being discriminated against. The Asian Christian community were better off under the British Empire. That says Jacob from Milton Keynes. The British essentially lost its empire by choosing to fight racism and standing up to the Nazis in 1939. The financial costs were immense, says Mark. Please ask your contributor why you can't be nostalgic about the empire, its achievements and Black History Month. The British Empire was instrumental in the abolition of slavery. Well, we'll get to that, Sathnam, something for you to cogitate over when we go to the news headlines. At 2:30, here's Nick Hatfield.
The voice of the UK. This is 5 Live.
Nihal Arthanayake. Listen live on digital, online, smart speaker, or the BBC Sounds app.
So here we are. Sathnam Sanghera is here, the journalist and author, to talk about his book Empireland, which has got a real conversation going on. And thank you for people who are questioning the ideas being put forward, based on fact, of course, and those who are in support. It's really interesting to hear a variety of views on this in a calm way. Lee Thompson has said, please ask Sathnam why you can't be nostalgic about the empire, its achievements and Black History Month. The British Empire was instrumental in the abolition of slavery. Sathnam.
Good question. I think when it comes to the legacies of slavery, it's really important to observe the complexity. And you can look at the legacies of slavery in my hometown of Wolverhampton, for example. We have the Black Country flag, which has chains on it. Those chains were made for industry, but also they were used in enslavement. But then in the center of town, you've got a statue of Prince Albert, famous statue of the man on the horse. And Prince Albert was at the forefront of the campaign to get slavery abolished. But I think it's important to observe both things in that we transported 3 million Africans across the Atlantic between 1660 and 1807, and then we abolished slavery. Both things are true. Unfortunately, people just want to mention one of those things. So Michael Gove gave a famous speech about Brexit where he said, we abolished slavery, without mentioning the 3 million Africans. I think you have to mention both. And I argue in my book, yes, we have racism in our country because of British Empire, but also we have a certain tradition of anti-racism in this country, which goes back to abolition. And what happened with abolition became a model for all sorts of social justice campaigns, for the suffragettes, for the trade unionists. But both traditions can exist at the same time.
Interestingly, in the book, Sathnam, we always have an idea that slavery happened elsewhere, that there were no black slaves in the UK. And you talk about these letters, these ads, in fact, from the 18th century, about the fact that even though legally you weren't allowed to, were you, keep slaves here?
The legal situation is complicated, but there was slavery in this country. There was a famous slave owned by the Molyneux family in Wolverhampton, hence the name Molyneux Stadium.
Right.
And yes, people, owners of slaves, would put adverts in papers, and there's a collection of them in a library, basically detailing how they could find their property again. And they're very vivid descriptions of the existence of slavery in the UK.
How does it help us as a country to come together? And this is, I guess, I'm kind of going back to almost the beginning of our conversation, how it helps us to understand these stories.
I think it's just like therapy. I would have therapy in order to work out my patterns of behavior so I don't make the same mistakes in the future. And similarly, I think we need to look at our national history so we don't repeat the same mistakes. I would argue one of the dysfunctional symptoms of the fact that we don't really understand our history is the exceptionalism we have in our politics, which emerges in weird ways like Brexit, or maybe in the way we've handled the COVID crisis, in this endless obsession with being world-beating, when actually just being average would be really good. But our politicians are obsessed with being world-beating, the best, when actually we don't need to do that. And I think that goes back to a time when we had the biggest empire in the world. It's created this idea that we don't have to obey the rules like everyone else.
It's interesting. I was listening to a podcast the other day about this very conversation, about whether we have to recalibrate where we are in the world. And when you think about empire and its effect on how we talk about ourselves today, the imperial hangover is that perhaps we haven't accepted our place in the world.
Absolutely. And in Boris Johnson, we have one of the most imperially nostalgic politicians we've ever had. In his spare time, he writes books about Churchill, famous war leader and imperialist. You know, he famously, I think, went to Burma and tried to read out a colonial poem. He talked about how Obama, you know, had a dislike of Britain, probably because of his part Kenyan heritage, which made him dislike the empire. He's always going on about empire. And also in Jacob Rees-Mogg, you've got a man who writes quite nostalgic books about the Victorians and how great they were. So I feel like we're being led by the most imperial politicians we've ever had. But I don't think they realize the effect of history that history has had on them.
But they also understand the importance of the globalized world that we live in. They understand the importance of doing trade with India, for instance. They understand the importance of the Commonwealth. They understand the importance about multiculturalism in this country.
Well, they understand it when it's convenient. But I've said earlier, actually, our internationalism is a very positive legacy of empire. But in their case, I feel like their emphasis on like being the great global free traders also is imperial, in that our obsession with free trade was also an imperial thing, in that it led to the Opium Wars and it led to the Great Potato Famine, where the Irish were sending food out of their country whilst they were starving, yes, because it was more important to remain true to free trade than to save lives.
Yes, a statement of fact, And then, of course, you need to talk about the Bengal famine.
Absolutely, same thing happened.
3 million Indians who died of malnutrition and malaria, and that was just in 1943.
Yeah, now there's some terrible famines in the 1700s and the 1800s too.
So many texts. Thank you so much, as always, for engaging with us in this conversation. Richard Samuelson in Oxfordshire. Good afternoon to you, Richard. Said, brilliant discussion, Nihal and Sathnam. As a British man with Jewish heritage, I've been saying for years that we need to face up to our own genocidal racism. But my German friends find it very difficult when I compare the Holocaust with British slave trade and slavery, the genocide of First Nations, Australians, Americans, etc. Thank you so much for such an excellent book, says Richard. Hi, Nihal. Most white British people didn't have a say on what happened in this country or its empire until very recently. My ancestors are not from noble families and weren't landowners. I'm sick as a white British person of being lumped in with the past rich landowners who led this country for so long during the imperial era, making evil decisions for their own personal gain. People like me and my ancestors, whilst treated better than non-whites, were also exploited. I completely agree with your guest on most things he said, and I'm looking forward to reading his book. However, it's about time that it was made clear that most white people alive today aren't descended or related to the rich white nobles who used us to further their own imperial vision. I mean, I'm not going to talk in any detail about this because there is currently, I believe, a court case and a man has been charged. But just this weekend, we saw on social media a person who was clearly, didn't seem to be of noble birth or an aristocrat, talking in exactly the kind of ways you would expect. And absolute credit to this country that the vast majority of people rounded on this individual. But, you know, the idea that this doesn't permeate down, as it were, if you want to look at a class structure in such a way, I'm not sure that rings true, Sathnam.
No, I'm actually referring to what another listener said. I actually don't think it's helpful to compare Germany, Nazi Germany to British Empire. They're such different things. I mean, empire went on for 500 years. World War II was a 6-year event with a clear beginning and end.
Sorry to interrupt you, Sathnam, but you do write in the book how Hitler himself was fascinated by the British Empire.
No, he was. He thought the British had just the right attitude with Indians. But Germany is a very good example in terms of how to deal with history, in that since World War II, they have actively and almost on a daily basis confronted their history. They have a film scene that regularly makes films about the Holocaust. They use it in their education. If you go to Berlin, you'll find things called stumble stones outside certain houses, where it tells you where Jewish families were abducted and sent to their deaths. It's a daily living process for them, whereas for us, it's just a weird feeling of amnesia and nostalgia.
Later on in the show, actually, Sathnam, I'm going to be speaking to a 97-year-old Auschwitz survivor, Lily Ebert, with her granddaughter and grandson. And it's very sobering to listen to her 17-year-old great-grandson and her granddaughter talk about, on Holocaust Memorial Day, the lengths that the Jewish community here in the UK have to go to this day.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best books I read was called Bloody Foreigners by Robert Winder. And he talks about this waves of immigration there's always been in this country. And he talks about the harrowing massacres there were of Jewish people going back to the 1200s. Anti-Semitism is almost the first racism. And like where Jewish communities suffer, other communities will suffer in the future.
You are listening to Sathnam Sanghera talking about his book Empireland. A number of people have texted in just for a reminder of that, so my apologies if I've not been saying that enough. But I'm not employed by his publisher. He's on to talk about this book because it's fascinating, and it's created a fascinating conversation with you listening to 5 Live. Jay Evans said most nations have blood on their hands. Mongol Empire, Roman Empire. Throughout history and across the globe, dictators have decimated people in their countries. The British were maybe the lesser of the evils, but they often created infrastructure and democracy. It's your guess that's myopic and sounding bitter, according to Jay Evans. Let's give a sell, because you do go into the numbers, and the numbers are fascinating. At the height of the British Empire in the 1920s, Sathnam, how much of planet Earth was essentially under the yoke of the British?
24%.
I mean,
the same surface area as the moon. I don't know if that's helpful. It's a lot of space.
It's a difficult thing to compare because I've never been on the moon. But
yeah.
Yes, okay. So that gives you a sense. All right.
And also it's complicated because empire changed so much. At one point, it was basically an enterprise led by companies such as the East India Company. And then it became under crown control, became official government policy. But it was never a legal entity, And it was different things to different peoples. It was different things to different nations. You could be living in one part of India and have a very different experience of empire than if you lived in another part. So that makes it very difficult to talk about or generalize about.
Yes. After the Second World War, it was seen as being politically, certainly in terms of PR, not helpful to stop people of colour coming into the UK, was it?
Yeah. I mean, it's attitudes towards race have changed so much.
Because I believe it said that that it would have issues for the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and another surprising thing I discovered was that one of the ministers which led the campaign to get more workers into the NHS was Enoch Powell. I mean, the man who made the famous Rivers of Blood speech in my hometown, a speech that was inspired largely by what he felt the Sikh community was doing in Wolverhampton, people like my parents. But he was leading the efforts to bring in people from empire.
It's often complicated. I heard the other day that Mitch McConnell, who was up until recently arch supporter of President Trump, was at the I Have a Dream speech. He was actually there, yes, with Martin Luther King. So there's interesting histories out there. Hi, Nihal. In relation to the previous listener about working class white people not benefiting from empire and slaveries, the very industries that non-slave owner Brits worked in and earned their keep from were powered by the money from empire and slavery. Just because you aren't directly descended from a slave owner doesn't mean you're not complicit in it. Britain's cities were built on the back of slavery, so it's impossible not to have benefited, said Ed in London. It's a difficult word to say complicit, isn't it? For generations hence. You're not complicit because you work at Liberty or you work for Shell in what
I would say
British...
a better word might be beneficiary. But you're right. I mean, cities like Glasgow, Liverpool, Bristol, parts of London exist purely because they made so much money from empire. And a third of our national trust houses have been revealed to have an imperial connection. Clive of India, who was the guy who really, put India into British hands, brought over the equivalent of £700 million. It's a lot of money. Warren Hastings, his successor, brought back £500 million.
Yes. Was it Pepys described Robert Clive?
I think you're thinking of Samuel Johnson.
Samuel Johnson, my apologies. Yes, wrong Samuel.
Clive killed himself, and Samuel Johnson thought it was an act of self-loathing because he'd got his money from such dodgy means. And this is a really important point. People will be listening to this saying, God, Sathnam is so woke. But what you've got to remember is during empire, loads of establishment figures railed against empire. So William Gladstone railed against the jingoism of empire in the 19th century. Queen Victoria regularly complained about how her citizens in empire were being treated by the military and so on. H.G. Wells, George Orwell, Ian Forster, they all railed about it. Churchill famously said that the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was monstrous. But when someone like me comes on the radio to say such a thing, I'm woke. But you got to remember, empire was fought against at the time.
But when you're accused of that, I guess we go back to something else that we've said, that perhaps underlying that is a sense that you as someone of colour does not have the right, does not have the ownership to say what all of those people like George Orwell and Ian Forster had said.
Yeah, I put a special footnote in the book explaining why people who tell me to be more grateful are being racist. And it goes to the heart of the imperial problem in that you and I, by some people, are not seen as British.
Thankfully, I have to say, in all my interactions on social media, I've met far more people who would take it as a given that people like you and I are British than I meet people who don't.
I think it's changed. It's a generational thing. I feel that the Black Lives Matter protests have exposed an entire new generation of people who feel very positive about racial diversity and also are much more knowledgeable about imperialism than we ever were. I feel that young people feel the way about museums the way that we felt about zoos when we were growing up. They can barely believe they exist. But I think it's going to take a couple of generations for those attitudes to become mainstream.
Abul Kalam has just tweeted, after reading The Last Mughal and Anarchy by William Dalrymple, I look forward to reading Empireland by Sathnam. These books should be on the national curriculum. It's interesting because you quote William Dalrymple in the book, don't you? When he says that that it's a real problem, the fact that in Britain, and I'm quoting William Dalrymple in your book here, a real problem that in Britain, study of empire is still largely absent from the history curriculum. Now more than ever, we badly need to understand what is common knowledge elsewhere, that for much of history, we were an aggressively racist and expansionist force responsible for violence, injustice and war crimes on every continent.
And he's not an activist. He's not a woke.
He's hardly.
He's someone who's spent his life writing incredible books about Indian history.
Yes.
And he's concluded that. So maybe we should listen to him.
Just bought the book, says Turnout Trout on Twitter. A great insight to a piece of history that is both celebrated and vastly misunderstood, misused by many, alongside a major root cause of the demise of Britain in the post-war period, and some still hark back to those with rose-tinted specs. Colony and empire exploited the working classes, natives of these islands, as well as the colonies and their people. We have to drag out the dark secrets that are hidden and examine them fully, or they will continue to rot us, says someone on the text. Nigel in Somerset says, excellent discussion with Sathnam. While I agree with many of the points he raises, the thing too frequently missed out in anti-empire discussions is context. The implication is too often that the white guys were the only ones doing bad stuff, yet in India there were horrific massacres and cruelty during the Mughal-Maratha wars, and the Mughals themselves were invaders from the 16th century. It wasn't just white Europeans who were invaders and exploiters. Understanding the whole picture is important, says Nigel in Somerset. And that's very true. I mean, that is very true.
It's true, but he's also going back to the old balance sheet idea that, we've got to weigh up the good and the bad. It's not a competition, man. It's not like a Venn diagram you can draw of the morality of it. I just want people to increasingly just say it was complicated. I mean, that seems to be a position that doesn't exist on this debate.
Yes.
It was really bloody complicated.
Yes. Well, that's why so often you see these debates had, and they'll have, Afua Hirsch will be there on one side and then someone else will be on the other side. And Afua Hirsch will spend, 45 minutes or half an hour being shouted at by someone. And you just really, because there's not much kind of calm debate involved in it, you don't really ever get to hear the facts of what. That's why David Olusoga is very good in his documentaries that he makes.
Yeah, I agree with David on everything he says. But yeah, the idea is it just doesn't exist, that position of saying things were complicated. Frankly, I feel nervous when someone says everything was bad about empire.
Yes.
I get nervous.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's true.
Yes.
But I get nervous when someone says everything was good.
Yes. And hallelujah. That's where we want to be, right? Where you can actually have a conversation and say, look, it wasn't all great. It was a racist enterprise. And you can accept that while looking at other parts of it as well. The nuance. Tony in Reading says, 1876. Good grief, none of us were alive then. Yes, the British did make mistakes. So did the Spanish in Mexico, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French. Every European nation in the 1700s and 1800s did things which are indefensible. But this was over 200 years ago. It feels like the only nation that gets constantly hammered on colonialism is the UK. We don't hear all the other countries getting slated every 5 minutes. It's time to move on and leave the past as a learning issue. Britain has said before is responsible for hundreds of good issues. Let's not forget these. And yes, it would be great to see a film with Indians and others in the two world wars. Fully agree. So for Tony in Reading, let's talk about Emmanuel Macron then. In talking about that it's only the British that get slated for this, let's talk about what Emmanuel Macron had to do in Tangiers in 2017.
Absolutely. Before that, can I just say it wasn't 300 years ago. In that empire still existed in Kenya in the 1950s, and empire was doing terrible things to Kenyans in the 1950s when black people were coming over here. So I don't think it was that long time ago.
Right.
And some of the books that were published to teach racist theories of empire were in print until the 50s and 60s and 70s. But yes, I mean, I think there's hope in that other countries are finding a way to talk about their colonial past. So Macron has said some very progressive things about what should be done with artifacts in French museums, that they should be repatriated, something that we do not entertain. And New Zealand has totally changed its curriculum recently. It has a similar history to us. Well, it was part of empire. Even America, which we like to look down on, we like to think America is more screwed up about race than we will ever be. There's a conversation happening in America about reparations for slavery. Biden's talked about it. Kamala Harris has talked about it. And we are so far from talking about reparations in this country. We haven't even learned to talk about empire in a sane way.
Daniel in London says, hello, when you consider the actions of the Indian government towards minorities since independence, you have to accept, Daniel, that in Sathnam Sanghera, you are speaking to a British Sikh, so he is well aware of what the Indian state has done to his community in India. What does this tell us about making judgments about the British Empire decades after it ended? Well, the point of the book, of course, is that there isn't a separation point. This isn't a historical tome. This isn't looking through rose-tinted or not glasses at something that quaintly happened centuries ago. This book is very much about how it affects us today.
Totally. It's a legacy. And people mock the phrase decolonization. But I look back in Empireland at my own education. And I didn't study a brown writer until my final term at university. And that is not only is a colonial way of teaching, it's also a failure in academic terms, in that I didn't get a broad education. I was taught entirely from one point of view. And I like most British people, were taught to value the novel, Western forms of film over all Eastern things. And I feel like with Empireland, I've been on a process of decolonization, and it has been a psychologically expanding experience. It hasn't been about restriction. When people hear the phrase decolonization, they think, oh God, it's people's names being deleted from curriculums. It's the opposite. It's expansion.
This is an interesting point from Jim in Cardiff, which makes this book part of the culture war for some people. Although this sounds a very interesting book, it is from a very left-wing angle. No one would argue that imperialism is positive, but there are more nuanced ways to look at it. Were we as bad as what was then normal as others? Did the UK make any improvements to lives in other countries? Did globalisation benefit them? The absence of context is so frustrating and not helpful in gaining wider understanding.
Well, culture warriors always think that their opposition are culture warriors and they never see themselves as culture warriors. Maybe I'm an example. But why is it left-wing? I don't understand why it's left-wing to point out historical fact. Since when did the left have a monopoly on historical fact? Of course they don't. That's because the right-wing have hijacked Empire as a culture war, I would say. But I mean, the nicest things that people have said about the book is that it's balanced, because that's why I wrote it. I just wanted to read a balanced book. And people have too many opinions. So it's basically a book for people who wouldn't normally read a book about history.
Okay, good. Well, what a sell to end our conversation with. Sathnam, as always, it's good to hang out with you. Good to speak to you.
Thanks, man.
Cheers. Sathnam Sanghera's book is called Empireland. Thank you for all your texts that came in. I unfortunately don't have time to read them all out. Coming up, some extraordinary stories of hope in these strange times.
The Voice of the UK. This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
BBC News at 3 o'clock. This is James Kelly.